I think for me, what I talk about when I talk about traditional conservative women, and I think it's important to understand, traditional conservative women rally against the idea of feminism as it's being defined in the modern world, because what we're rallying against is a pro-abortion movement. What we're rallying against is a pro-promiscuity movement. We're rallying against the idea that masculinity is toxic and very much defending, men and their masculinity. We're defending the fact that men and women are different with different needs and different biological tendencies, and we're just completely different in many respects. So I think that we distinguish, founding feminism, which I always say was, a movement that was largely pro-life, actually, and that was a movement to guarantee opportunity to women that they didn't have in society. For example, the right to vote, the right to engage in education. It was an equality of opportunity as opposed to what it is now, which is an equality of outcomes. And those are two very, very different movements. So I'm not in any way suggesting that I or young women or you or anyone who's coming of age in this environment isn't influenced by the feminist doctrine that kind of is just woven through pretty much everything you consume. But I am suggesting that there are people, largely conservative women, who don't want to be identified with a movement that has become largely a man-hating movement, in my view. And so there is a distinction there. And I think that people who aren't in the political sphere oftentimes don't understand that distaste for the word. It's not about, for me, it's not a conversation about femininity or whether you have a career in that respect. What I have the really gross distaste for is that it has become a highly politicized movement, an anti-woman movement, an anti-men movement. None of the advice they're giving out is good for men or women, in my perception. And it's highly politicized. It's all hard leftists that identify as feminists today. You won't find a conservative woman wanting to wear that label because they feel it's been deeply corrupted. So even though we do have that film over our eyes, and I'm willing to acknowledge that for sure. I'm sure that, I'm 43, but I was raised at a time where I was receiving those messages of it is, can be dangerous to lean on a man. And if a guy gets a career, and let's say you get married to a guy and you don't have a career and that guy has a career, he's going to be able to build himself up all those years. And if he leaves you, you're left with nothing. I heard all of that around me growing up. So of course that had an impact on how I saw the world. And of course that registered as an impressionable young girl, no question. But I was never in the camp of what feminism has become today, which is detestable in my view, helping neither men nor women, and also committed to denying that we are different. So I think that's where that disconnect lies for me. Maybe you can appreciate that perspective. I don't know.
Well, okay. So first and foremost, I don't see waves of feminism. I think feminism has been the same thing that it has always been since 1848, 1849, Seneca Falls. Okay, that's where the suffragette movement got its start. Just so we're clear, I've done a lot of homework on this over the years, just so we know what's going on here. First wave feminism created what was known as proto-patriarchy theory. So it's like most of the old school suffragettes, a lot of people don't realize this. They want to separate feminism into separate waves. Like first wave feminism was the suffragettes, right? Got to remember that from 1849-ish all the way up to 1920, you're looking at what? About like 70 years of the suffragette movement. And by the way, suffragettes weren't just the United States. It was also in the UK and all over the place. Okay. So they were, if you want to separate things into the good feminism versus the bad feminism. And my take is it's all the same thing. There's never been waves of particular feminism. Yes, did they want to get the right to vote? Of course. Well, what was the latent purpose of that? What was voting all about back in the turn of the century? What was voting about? Well, we just voted, in the midterms right now, but back in, the late 1800s, all the way up to 1920, which was when the 19th Amendment was ratified, we had a very different understanding of what voting entailed. So for men, you had to have skin in the game, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of people say, well, black people were only worth 3/5 of a vote or something like that, and women didn't get to vote at all. And there, right up until about the turn of the century, really into the 1920s and post World War I, was women's right to vote even even really a serious consideration for women themselves at that time. So if you go back and you look at the literature of that time, voting was more of like, it was sort of a duty rather than sort of this idea that, well, everybody should have like the popular vote kind of thing, or the reason why we still have the electoral college. So the idea of voting at that time was, well, if men are going to be the ones who are going to go out there and die for their country, and remember how many people had just died in World War I, that voting had to be taken much more seriously, and it was much more representative of the people who had like skin in the game, and that was men at the time. So when also you have to understand the conditions under which the 19th Amendment was ratified. So it came down to one vote by one, I believe it was one senator in Tennessee. He was a very young guy. I think he was 22. And the only reason he voted for the ratification of the 19th Amendment is because his mom sent him a note that said, vote for women, right? And essentially the guy was a simp, or was a beta enough to do what mommy told him to do, cast his vote, and the rest is history. So there's a lot that goes along with the quote unquote good first wave feminists versus the bad, second wave feminists. My argument is that it has always been the same movement. It has always been a female supremacism movement. It has always been, in most cases, a hate movement. And the reason why I say that is because back in the turn of the century, first wave, quote unquote, first wave feminists, they were considered terrorists back then. They were, they were against Black women's rights. They were considered terrorists. They were considered white supremacists. They were against men's rights. They tried to assassinate male politicians. They jailed their own husbands. They wanted female dictators. They opposed female military service while shaming men and boys, and as young as 16 with the white feather movement back in World War I to join the military and get killed. They destroyed children's relationships with their fathers. There was a thing called the tender years doctrine, I think is what it was. But you got to remember that the same feminism that started in 1848 is really still the same feminism that got traction in a post-sexual revolution world. So when we talk about the bad feminism, that's usually a post-sexual revolution feminism, right after hormonal birth control was at the advent of that. And then, of course, we get abortion. Then we get no-fault divorce, which, by the way, comes hot on the heels of the sexual revolution. Yeah. We see that and I got the stats to show you, we see a rise into a huge spike in divorce right after hormonal birth control becomes much more readily available right around 1965-ish. And it tracks almost identically correlates, I should say, identically with the rise in divorce. Then 1968 rolls around. Our good friend Ronald Reagan decides to institute no-fault divorce right around 1968, 1969. Then we have Roe v. Wade, which was 1974, 1973, somewhere around there. You see all of these change. Title IX comes in the mid 70s or late 70s. You see all of these changes happen in rapid succession right after one invention, which was hormonal birth control, which essentially puts the human reproductive process in the hands of one sex. And so as a result, we get to where we're at right now. We want to look at I call it militant feminism, but this is like the Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan feminism that comes in the wake of the sexual revolution. So the way that I interpret this anyways is there are no waves of feminism. It's still the same thing. It's just interrupted by wars, by social unrest, by the sexual revolution, by Woodstock, by the boomers, you just name if you look at how things track. And also, by the way, it's no coincidence that Marxism starts right around the same time that Seneca Falls hits. So you're looking at the Communist Manifesto starts gaining traction right around the mid 1800s, same time that the suffragettes start their own movement. So really what I'm saying is that feminism, there are no waves of feminism. It's always been the same damn thing. It's just that we forget about what was going on back in the day when we're looking at women bombing, police precincts, and we're looking at women, of the suffragette movement. We're considered terrorists of that time, but we don't talk about that because, they got the right to vote. So and what has happened since women got the right to vote. That women overwhelmingly decide elections, and that's where we're at right now. It's not a coincidence that abortion suddenly becomes an issue for our midterm elections. It's not a coincidence that student debt forgiveness, and Elizabeth Warren on record saying, back in March, that we need student debt forgiveness because women need a fair shake, and they need to get an honest, fair start, because they can't go forward and build businesses and be successful if they have all this student debt that they took on themselves, because we give women special dispensation and grants and everything else to get those loans in the first place. Of the $1.7 trillion in student debt right now, 2/3 of that is owned by women.
Yeah,
so, it's essentially the $10,000 that you get for your student debt forgiveness, courtesy of Uncle Joe Biden. That's just a stimmy check. That's a $10,000 stimmy check for women, largely women who have taken out those loans.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk all day, separate conversation probably about what happens in politics. I mean, I'll have no disagreement for you there that they largely target, young unmarried women to go and vote for leftist causes over and over again, and largely successfully that happens. I do believe that the abortion issue was a key issue for a lot of those women in terms of this election that we're just seeing the results of right now. They turned out, and that was largely the reason why. So you have no disagreement from thee there. I do disagree with you. I do continue to disagree with you about the movement as it started and the movement in terms of what it's become. And one of the primary reasons that I do is because when you're in politics, all you hear from the modern feminist movement is abortion, 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 abortion. So much so that women who are pro-life are excluded completely, regardless of what else they agree with. They are excluded completely from the modern feminist movement, from their rallies, from everything. If you're pro-life, you're done. Beyond even if I were a conservative who were pro-choice, I would be welcome. But because I'm pro-life, you've got to be excommunicated from that movement. So that distinction for me is very big, because feminism did not start in any way or respect or shape or form as a pro-abortion movement. It was actually quite the opposite. And I also think that the times were different. So I don't excuse, hatred of another sex anytime. I don't care if it was when, the suffrage movement was happening. I don't care if it's now, but society was different. I do see many components of that early feminist movement as wanting, again, that distinction between wanting equality of opportunity in a society where women weren't able to do some things that men were able to do. That was just a reality. And modern times where now they want equality of outcomes. They want men and women to be the same. And they want this perception of inequity in places like the gender pay gap that doesn't actually exist. So it's not real. What they're talking about now, it's not a real discrepancy. I mean, they put that lie out about, and we covered it extensively on this show, about the gender pay gap, when that's really coming from decisions that women are making for themselves about how many hours they want to work a week, what jobs they want to take, and all of that stuff. So there's a lot of falsehoods that emerge, whereas when feminism started, there was a reality in the discrepancy of what men and women were able to do in society, that those individuals, those leaders, and I'm not talking about every feminist, but I'm talking about the leaders of the movement, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Mary Wollstonecraft, were seeking to address. So that is the distinction for me. If you like the short clip and want to watch another short clip, click here. Or if you want to watch the full episode, click right here.